You're listening to Idea Collider, a show that explores the world of asymmetric learning. On this show, I will sit down with pharmaceutical experts and business leaders to discuss how to embrace uncertainty and the different learning style that follows. I'm your host, Mike Rea. Let's get into the show.
Hello.
Hello, Rita. How are you doing?
I'm very well. How are you?
I'm doing fine. Are you? You're in the northeastern states.
I am. I'm actually in Princeton, New Jersey.
Oh, lovely. I love Princeton.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah, I always feel like it's a little bit like coming home to England when I get to Princeton.
Indeed.
Fantastic. And I have to say, what an honor to meet you. It's
nice to meet you.
It's wonderful to have someone with your kind of deep credentials and on the podcast. So thank you so much for agreeing to do it.
Pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Begin by telling us something about you and how you got to where you are. So, short history and the kind of highlights that got you here. So, if you don't mind us starting with that, that'd be wonderful.
Sure.
Thank you.
So I was born in New Haven, Connecticut,
Mm-hmm.
and both of my parents at that time were on the faculty of the Yale Medical School. So my mother was a microbiologist and my dad was an organic chemist. So grew up in a very nerdy scientific family. When an argument broke out at dinner time, there was nothing that couldn't be resolved by consorting with a reference book. And so that was a bit of my background. So I guess I had that as part of the DNA of growing up. And then my dad took a job with Xerox, which was fascinating because it was in the years where Xerox was funding Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, or PARC, which was where many of the technologies we take for granted were actually created, right? So, and then he went over to Kodak, which was fascinating because, he'd seen the future. And then he went to Kodak and Kodak didn't want any part of it. So that was sort of in the mix of my background growing up. So I went to school in New York City. I went to university at Barnard College and majored in political science of all things, and then got a degree in public administration, and then worked in the public sector for close to a decade, doing municipal government work, which was very interesting because if you're young and you're in one of those pivotal positions at that moment in your development, your career just goes like this. I mean, you've got incredible authority and ability to make things happen and ability to kind of be where the leverage is. But the trouble is your career goes like this and then it goes like that for the rest of your foreseeable life. At which point I decided to make a transition and I went and did a PhD at the Wharton School. And through my experiences with the city of New York, I got very interested in large-scale organizational change. How do organizations actually change from one state of being to another? And so I went to Wharton with this bright idea of studying the science of implementation. And my sponsor, who was running the Entrepreneurship Center at the time, said he couldn't think of anything more boring than talking about the science of implementation. And then, as luck would have it, we got a grant from Citigroup. Citigroup, and it was a 3-year grant to study their corporate venturing process. And our sponsor had this idea that that we forget, right? We forget what actually happened, and so we have this incomplete picture of what allows an innovation to really break through and what causes them not to. And I was put in charge of that project, and so the dissertation really became about corporate venturing, or how companies create new capabilities. And so that's what got me on the track of innovation in internal corporate venturing. And that worked out really well. And so then when I went on the market, I joined Columbia and I've been there ever since.
Interesting. And I think you're being very humble. I think some of the comments that come next to your books, it's rare that Clayton Christensen sort of calls out an idea of someone's as one of the greatest ideas ever. So could you expand a little bit on some of the books and the ideas that you put out in the world?
Happy to. So my first book was called The Entrepreneurial Mindset. And the goal of that book was really to say, what can companies who need to innovate over and over and over again? So what can large companies learn from the practices of habitual entrepreneurs? And that was really the core idea behind Entrepreneurial Mindset. The second book was Market Busters, and that was how do we identify, moves in markets at the sort of micro market level, so not the big strategy level, but kind of at the micro market level that unlock real opportunities for growth. The third book was Discovery Driven Growth, and I'll come back to that in just a second, which is really about how do you invent practices in your organization that can compete under conditions of high uncertainty.
Yeah.
And then I published The End of Competitive Advantage, was really a perspective on the changing nature of strategy and of competitive advantage. And then my most recent book is Seeing Around Corners, which has to do with strategic inflection points. So the specific idea that Clay talked about really, and there's a whole wonderful backstory about it because both of us were young professors in the 90s. He had just come off a very successful career as a consultant, and he'd run his own company and he'd done a bunch of things, but wanted to go back and become an academic. And I had come up through a slightly more traditional academic path, but both of us were working on this problem of, why is it that when people try to do new things, they get it so terribly wrong. And Clay's sort of angle was this notion of disruptive technology, which is, under certain circumstances, the very things we talk about in business school as being assets to your business. So you're close to your customers and listen to what they're telling you and you do things to provide them with better service. But those very things can become traps under certain circumstances. And what I was working on was something called discovery-driven planning, which was, how do you plan when you haven't got the data that you'd like to be able to do a conventional plan? And so our ideas kind of came together in this notion of Clay looking at uncertainty, competition emerging from below, incumbents overshooting. And I came at it with, okay, how do you create a business model that makes sense for a highly uncertain venture when you really just don't know yet whether it's going to work or not?
Interesting. And I'm going to go back to your father, actually, if that's okay, because seeing Xerox PARC, seeing Kodak, who didn't miss the ideas, they just missed the implementation, right? They were there early, but decided not to.
Both companies. Xerox famously had a book written about this. It was called Fumbling the Future. Yep. And Kodak, invented a lot of these digital technologies. And I will never forget my dad telling me about the first day on the job at Kodak. He's sitting across the desk from a guy named Thomas Whiteley, who was in charge of the emulsion research laboratory at Kodak. So, lifetime Kodaker, sticking in the army, bleeds silver halide, that kind of guy. And so Whiteley says to my dad, he says, well, so how do you think all this is going to play out? What do you see as the next big things in technology? And my dad, and I remember he sort of visited the future metaphorically. And he said, oh, it's very clear it's all going to be digital. Imaging is going to be done in a different way. 8mm film has had it, lays it all out, right? And Whiteley kind of goes, frozen in the headlights. And the response was, well, that's all great. Go back to the labs where you can do minimal damage. It was kind of the thought. And something very profound came out of that for me, which was, I asked my dad a few years later, I said, well, long after the story with Kodak had reached a rather sad denouement. And I said to him, well, didn't it bother you? And he said, what do you mean bother me? And I said, well, you saw it so clearly, and yet look what happened. And my dad looked at me and he said, look, I'm a scientist. I said, uh-huh. He said, he's management. Like, he asks me my scientific opinion. I give it to him. He's management. What he does with it is his problem. And it really struck me. And it's actually something that stuck with me in my more recent work because there's always somebody that sees it. There's always somebody that knows, right? It's just they're not in the right position. They don't have the audience. They don't have the power. They don't have the courage. They don't have the standing to say to the organization, hey, big things need to be done here.
It's so interesting, and I've heard similar stories from folks who worked at Nokia and other companies that were there first but missed the wave anyway. And it's an interesting thing because from your organizational perspective, you talk about implementation, but one of the things is the people who see it aren't necessarily connected to other people who see it in the same business or who aren't addicted to the current status quo. The people that are currently successful maybe are the wrong people to be taking decisions about what comes next.
Well, that's right. And I think this gets at a really interesting kind of backstory. And I talked to my friend Jeff Pfeffer. He's at Stanford about this a lot. And he's just come out with this really great book called 7 Rules of Power. And one of the things that I think happens in companies is people that are in the innovation area. They see what's coming, they have a sense of urgency about it, but they don't have power. And if you don't have power, the decisions are going to be made by the people that do have power. And almost inevitably, the people that have power today got it through some set of mechanisms, which this innovation is going to upset. And I'll pick up on the Nokia story. So I literally was in, I want to say Ulu or one of their research labs, held in my hand a tablet-sized device. It used a stylus. It didn't use touchscreen, but it used a stylus. You could get on the internet. You could run apps. You could do, I mean, it was an iPad to all intents and purposes, and they nailed it. And yet, despite the fact that they had spent literally hundreds of millions of dollars on R&D during that period, they couldn't get it to market. The guys that were running the existing business units were just like, this is weird. This is complicated. It's going to upset my quarterly numbers. I don't see where I don't get it. I don't get the vision for it. But those were the people that had the power.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'd be interested. So, a lot of your work is focused on the kind of, I want to say, a monolithic company structure, right? Where there is someone in power, there's someone, down here that's trying to get things done. And the people at the top don't necessarily have the same incentive as the people who are coming up with the ideas. So do you see it as an implementation challenge or a culture challenge, or is it something else that helps companies unlock that opportunity?
So it's a little bit of each. And I think, building an innovation program, first of all, requires three things. So you have to get this flow of great ideas, but it can't be innovation theater. And when I say innovation theater, what I mean is let's fly to Silicon Valley, and we'll ride around the Google campus, or let's have an innovation boot camp, and thousands of Post-it notes, die a horrible death while we ideate. I mean, not that any of that is bad, but to really have innovation come out of it, you need a second process, which is incubation. And that's taking this raw concept of maybe what could be a future possibility and testing it and nurturing it and getting it to a stage where you get real customer feedback and figuring out if there is product market fit. And then a third process is the process of acceleration. And that is bringing your fledgling new thing to a state where it could be part of the parent corporation. So yeah, guess what? You have to invite in the lawyers, and you have to have the compliance people be happy with you, and. So the first, I think, thing to remember is that you have to have processes set up for those three things, and most companies don't. Second thing is that there are four, I'll call them processes as well, that need to come together that often don't. So the first one is your strategy process, right? Now, when strategy is done right, it's pulling you into the future, saying this is what we believe about where things are going, and this is where we want to participate in that. It's inspiring and wonderful and, really exciting. And then you have your budget process. All too often your budget process is like lead weights around your feet because it begins in the past. It's like, where does this year's budget start last year's budget? And a lot of times there's no intervention that sort of says, wait a minute, if this is our strategy, we need to have our best resources lined up against that. We just don't see that. The third process is your project governance process. So who decides what gets worked on, who decides who's working on it, who decides what gets budget, what doesn't. And that is often totally disconnected to either budgets or strategy. And so if you pick up the lid on a corporate portfolio, it's typically a mess. There's stuff that has been in there. It's somebody's pet duck from, 4 CEOs ago, and nobody said, why are we still doing this? Or, it's such a sacred cow, nobody's brave enough to say, honestly, this is getting nowhere. Or you've got stuff that's mission critical, absolutely important. This is our future. And nobody's really working on it full time, right? So you see all these mismatches. And then the last process is the process by which people feel that they're going to be rewarded. And so to have an innovation structure, I'll call it a structure, not even a culture, but to have a structure, you need to have those things working together. And very often they don't. They work completely at odds with one another. So if you've got a CEO, right, who's on a 2-year clock time frame in his or her own mind, and you've got an innovation program which won't bear fruit for 4 or 5 years, and you know that, right? Unless you've got a countervailing structure which says, well, actually, no, you'll get a piece of the reward for this long-term thing happening, in some way that makes sense to you. Unless you've got some structure to do that, the logical thing to do is not worry about the innovation. Pass it off to the next people. You'll be long gone by then. And we see that all the time. And I think it's a leadership challenge, but I think it's also unrealistic to expect human beings to respond to incentives in any way other than what makes the most sense for them.
Absolutely. And it's an issue that we've confronted in in pharmaceuticals with, call it a phase transition problem, right? I mean, so I think there's two phase transition problems. One is moving customers from the way they are today to the way they need to be, right? So let's say you need to move them to gene therapy from where they are. That's a shift that they need to make as well as you. And, Michael Rea and others written about that. But the phase transition problem, I think, is the biggest, is exactly that incentive problem, that you can be rewarded for moving products very easily from one phase to the next in pharmaceuticals without it ever making a dent in something that you might launch, right? So you get incentivized, you get rewarded for numbers of candidates that make it from phase 1 to phase 2 or phase 2 to phase 3, none of which might ever have a chance of success, but that you've done your job, you've contributed to the process. Mm-hmm. So I guess one question for you, as you've looked at across companies, is why do they all have one process? Why is there one innovation process in companies which seems at odds with the idea of innovation in general, right? That there's one decision process, there's one strategy. Why not have a few horses running it with different approaches to life?
Well, and I recommend that you do. So a portfolio model that I like to use says, look, you've got your core business, and in your core business, there's two choices, right? How do you keep your existing good, healthy core businesses healthy? How do you disengage from the ones that are not going to be part of your future, right? Then you have your new platforms, which I would say are candidates to be the next generation core business. So these are Amazon Web Services, slotting in being something, a companion to Amazon. And those will eventually become the core, and that's great. And then you have your options. And in options, what you're doing is you're making hopefully smallish investments today that buy you the right, but not the obligation to make a future investment. So as an example, if I were to take what's going to come after Zoom, I don't know. You don't know. No, the data do not exist, right? Is it going to be holographs? Is it going to be something you project on the ceiling from your phone? Is it going to be bendable screens? Is it going to be robots? I mean, I have no idea. But if I was Cisco or Oracle or Zoom, and it's important that I know the answer to that question, then I would want to, I would want to have bets, like small bets placed in each of these areas, so that I'm close to the phenomenon. I'm seeing what's maturing. I'm seeing who the players are. I'm seeing what the networks are. And it's a very different idea than I'm investing for ROI. I'm investing for insight and knowledge and kind of building that. And that's, I think, where companies need a different process, right? You need lots of experimentation.
Yeah, and it's interesting, especially in an industry that's mostly based on experimentation, is that there's very little experimentation with ideas, right? So, I've written a lot about the idea of asymmetric learning, that the asymmetry in your ability to learn faster than someone else that has the same product, that's the competitive advantage going forward. So finding out what the drug does, finding out whether the market might want it, those two things themselves are, you either embrace the uncertainty or you try and predict your way out of it. And I think most companies are trying to predict, what a market opportunity looks like, what a drug might do, right, despite the fact that the only way of doing either is to experiment, is to try it and see. So I'd be interested in your experience in, what might be the reasons that companies prefer the kind of confidence of false confidence, if you like, instead of the uncertain approach.
Well, I think it comes back almost to the work that's done on cognitive biases, and this wonderful book, Thinking Fast and Slow, which I think by Daniel Kahneman. And he argues that it's deeply rooted in biology. And I think I see a certain amount of sense in that. So our brains are built to conserve energy. And so our brains leap to making decisions in the most seamless, grit-free, convenient way possible. And so the easy, quick decisions are the ones that we gravitate to. So, and yet what Kahneman observes is the slow thinking, that process of saying, wait a minute, I'm going to take a step backward. I'm going to take my time. I'm going to look at this. I'm going to turn it around and around. And that's hard work, and it's effortful, and it feels slow, right? So I'll give you an example from a client situation I'm facing right now in pharma. So this is a very interesting situation. And obviously it's confidential, but it's a certain kind of, call it a digital product, which is going to provide feedback to a patient to create a behavioral response on their part. And so my colleague and I have been asked to work with this project team to use techniques like discovery-driven planning to sort of build out this thing. And what the client is requesting is follow the plan. So the first challenge was, we try to get them to define what success is. And we thought that was going to take half an hour. We thought that would be completely clear to everybody. Turns out no. So the region has a different definition than the headquarters does. Headquarters has a different definition than the project team. It's a mess. And so finally we get somebody to step up and say, okay, here's, I'm willing to say what success is. So then the next thing is, okay, well, how are you going to sell this thing? What price are you going to charge? And so, they're saying, well, we don't know, this and that. And then my colleague and I are saying, well, you say you've done this market research, right? They hired this market research firm. They've got 12 different ecosystem partners meeting on a regular basis. And some of the very basic proof of concept questions that we were starting to ask, they are not willing to respond to. But then the pièce de résistance, so the head of this whole shebang comes to us and says, well, we think you should stop working on this project because the plan is so far advanced that we can't change it now. And I'm looking at them going, you based a plan on air. You have made this up out of whole cloth. And my prediction is they are headed right for a complete disaster. And, I can say that. And I don't mean this personally, but I think this is what happens, right? Your brain gets into a mode where you say, I've got to have a plan. It's got to be filed by the end of the year. This is going to have to get put in my, the 2023 budget. I've got to make sure that I've got that. I ticked off all the boxes. I wrapped it up in a piece of paper and now I'm done. And along comes this really awkward academic saying things like, well, have you tested whether it actually does in the field what you say it will? Have you tested whether it solves a real problem? Have you tested any of these things? And the answer basically is no. And they're so resistant to doing those tests, they'd rather stop my work on the project than sort of have to go revisit that. And so here's, I think, the crux of it, which is stopping now and revisiting some of those assumptions feels painful. It feels effortful, it feels painful, it feels like I'm going to slow everything down if I do that. And so what we'd rather do is wait 3 years, go through a clinical process, get it out into the market, and then have it fail. I mean, it's astonishing to me.
Yeah, no, I see it almost every day. Fortunately, less and less. But a good example, we did a premortem with a group that was about to run a study. And the interesting thing was we'd run this workshop, so it'd been a good workshop. They'd focused on the future, what they were going to do, when it was successful. They said, well, we got some time at the end of the workshop. We ran a premortem. We said, just go with me. 3 years time, the study's failed. I want you to tell me why it failed. And the first response was, we don't want to do that. It's not going to fail. Well, okay, just trust me. So go the exercise. It has failed. I want you to tell me why. And one by one, some of them started to pick the stickies up, and some of them started to look over and see what each other was writing. And eventually they got rolling. They got rolling, and suddenly the wall was filled with stickies. And then you could pass this stuff out. And actually, it was interesting just how much volume there was in and here's the reasons, so operational, technical, clinical. Mm-hmm. And they put it on the wall. And I've never seen a group of people look more depressed. But the answers were in there, right? So I said, well, then we could pass them and go, well, now you've got something you can do about it. You can mitigate the risks. So you can start to have a plan to address these things that to be true, but might never be. Said, why have you never done this before? And I said, well, no one's ever asked us whether this might fail. They've only asked us what to do in the face of success and to give it positive spin. Right. And actually, roll forward 3 years, the study did fail. And actually, a lot of the reasons that it failed were already written down 3 years ago, but no one did anything about it then. So to your point, a lot of people are much more comfortable with call it like a hesitant decision than a decisive hesitation, to pause and correct things. So I'm almost fascinated by, industry-wide and non-pharma examples of that. So
yeah, well, I'm suspecting in the case of this particular project, there's someone somewhere in the decision-making chain who's planning to move on. Right. They're planning to take either their next job or their next role with another company, or they're planning to do something. And they want to be able to say, well, when I was in charge of that project, it was going beautifully. It only fell apart after I left. Right. And so there's this kind of, you have to really understand the personal motivations that are going to affect that. And it's so hard to get to the real study, right? To get to the real reason something happened the way that it did, that it's very easy then for people to spin it into a completely different story.
Yeah, and something you've written about before that I always found appealing was how much easier it is to say no than it is to say yes within an organization. So could you give me some of your thinking on that?
Yeah, so there's a couple of nuances to that. So it's hard to say no when things have picked up a certain amount of steam, and this kind of project is something that I would say. It's easy to say no at that very early fledgling. Ooh, what if we thought about doing it this way? And that's when people look. We tried that once and it didn't work. That's not how we do things around here. Oh, our clients would never accept that. And people will make up in their heads all these reasons this thing is impossible, and it kills off a lot of creative innovation right at the beginning. And the reason that's problematic is we know innovation is a numbers game. That we know that to get one or two really smart breakthrough ideas that are material enough for a large organization, right? I mean, that's the problem. Like, if you're an entrepreneur and you start a business and it makes $700,000 a year, that's awesome. Like, there's no problem there. If you're Novartis and you start a project and it makes $700,000, that's a disaster. So you gotta have an idea that will scale, and therefore, obviously, it's a rare idea, right? So you need lots and lots and lots of ideas before you get one that's really got to be able to take your company into the future. And so that no process, that oh, we've never tried that, it didn't work, we tried that, we had a project like that some years ago, all that reasons people don't want to do anything different, is it truncates the volume of ideas you're going to be able to work through.
And actually, I was listening to someone describe their process, in a company, and apparently the program team. So there's no representatives of team structures further up the organization. The folks who come in might be regulatory, they might be clinical, they might be commercial, and they report upwards vertically into their organizations, right? So I said, well, that has to lead to the regulatory people being disincentivized from taking any risk. Why would you take any risk if there's no skin off your nose if you said no? Right? So you say no. No one's ever done this before. No one's ever going to question you because they don't want risk in the regulatory group. The commercial people might be pushing for something, but they have no lever to make change in the team. So I think what was clear to me was there was almost this multicultural approach where the cultures of the divisions were going to be the kind of arbiters for whether a decision gets made, but they weren't aligned. They were in disaligned incentives in that team. So, well, who would have designed a structure like that to be successful in an innovation-based culture? And her response was, actually, no one really knows where it was designed, but it's hard to shift. So, to your point, how do you get an organization to shift from where it is to this to-be place? Have you seen any positive examples of companies that have shifted overnight?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, I've worked with Fidelity Personal Investments under the direction of Kathy Murphy, and they were a very successful but very traditional investment house, right? They offered investment products to investors. They charged fees for those products, blah blah blah. And she was met with this deep sense of unease, and I want to say about 2014. And called up my colleague Ram Sharan, who you probably know, he's a very famous management consultant. And her concerns were as follows. The fintech companies were not tackling financial service stalwarts head on, but they were nibbling, right? So they'll nibble a little bit at FedEx, Forex, and they'll nibble a little bit at pet insurance, and they'll nibble a little bit. And the bundled structure of financial services, she worried, was at risk. But the bigger challenge that she felt her organization had was that they were very product out. So I'm in structured investments, or I'm in checking accounts, or I'm in, whatever it was. And all we talk about is that way of looking at the world. And so she started an experiment. And the experiment was, today we might think of it as lean, that kind of set of methodologies that comes when you have product teams that have all the capabilities that they need, so they can see a complete app or implementation through from beginning to end. So they don't have to, it's not like a waterfall where you're waiting for the next group, right? And so all the product teams are there. They work in relatively concentrated periods of time. So, but they also are oriented around a typical customer problem. So, as an example, how do I get someone to be able to log on to their account in half the time that it typically takes, right? Is there something we could do to make it just super frictionless and easy for a customer to log on? And that might be something that team would work on for 2 or 3 weeks. And then they'd hand over a complete product, to be implemented or to be dealt with. And she did a pilot with it. They found that they did their new enhancements in 25% of the time it had previously taken to do that with an equivalent traditionally structured team. And eventually she turned the entire organization into that. And this led them to an innovation, which I remember absolutely shocking the world. I was at a convention of chief strategy officers, and they, three of them were from competing organizations. And this was 2018. And Fidelity just announced that they were having no fee offers for three of their major investment products. Now, all these other guys made their money on fees. And here's Fidelity basically saying, we're going to give this product away for free. And the switch that they had made was the teamwork was one part. But the second part was, let's look at the lifetime value of a customer for us over a long time horizon. And what we want is a free entry level product so that we can get younger people into our ecosystem right from the get-go. And so they had this vision of how are we going to completely transform our relationship with, especially our younger customers, in a way that, feeds to our long-term benefit. And it was hugely successful.
Interesting. Because I'm always fascinated by the kind of comfort that tech companies have with that kind of, customer level innovation, to, trial and error, experimentation. And the more traditional companies seem a lot more stuck in, we've got to know that this is going to be right before we'll do it, or even think about doing it, even though they know that they don't know very much about, any of the things that they need to know about. Yeah. Do you see a difference between tech and kind of legacy companies, or is it am I seeing that the wrong way?
Well, I would frame it in terms of the difficulty of creating a prototype or a test versus other. And certainly legacy comes into it, but you can prototype a digital product very, very easily. You can mock up an app, you can do a wireframe. And there's a lot of ways with a digital product you can get responses. It gets harder when you have physical products. Now you can still do it, right? You can make mock-ups out of styrofoam, you can use Gumby bands, there's things you can do to mock up a physical environment, but the closer you get to something that has to have a lot of features in it before you can actually test it out, the more expensive it's likely to be. Now, that much being said, I think a lot of people use that as an excuse. So I'll give you an example that Steve Blank uses. He was teaching an entrepreneurship class, and the students work on their businesses. And this group of students had an idea that they were going to create this drone surveillance system for selling information to agriculture. And that they would put up these drones and they would get cameras and they'd have all these sensors, and then farmers would buy this information. And Steve was like, well, hang on, before you go spend tens of thousands of dollars on putting up drones, aren't there things in the sky right now that, you could hook a camera on? And it turns out, yes, there are. There are weather balloons and weather satellites and stuff like that. And so what the students did as a prototype was they just took a bunch of relatively inexpensive cameras, got them up on other people's devices, right? And then they used the data that they collected to see if it would have any value to the farmers whatsoever. And they made a few sales, and they said, hang on, this is actually valuable stuff. And so then what they focused on was the image collection devices and the value in the data, rather than worrying about putting up fleets of drones, which would have been much more expensive and much less desirable.
Interesting. And I'm going to flip to the conversation around serendipity, because I know you've written about this before, and I've written a lot about the idea of what I call planned serendipity, because there's this uncomfortable truth for the pharma industry that a lot of the good products were discovered serendipitously, right? They weren't pre-planned in that sense, but I've had to explain to a lot of people the difference between serendipity and luck, as in seeing the opportunity in what just happened, and then providing the environment for good things to happen. So, your case study is almost an example of that. But, maybe once you see the results of an experiment, you're in a different place than you could have been sitting on a whiteboard. Could you explain a little bit more about your thinking on serendipity?
Sure. So I think there's a preparation to see serendipity. I think far too many of us look at the world, with patterns that are already in our minds that we don't actually see in front of us. And there's some evidence. So Matt Richtel, who's a Pulitzer Prize winning author, I've just reading his book Inspiration, and he talks about this as well. And he says it's been shown that highly creative people, if you present them with a visual field, they actually see more objects than people who have not sort of embraced the desire or need to be creative. So there's a question of, do you make the space to have things that might challenge your views sort of appear in your field of view? And then do you have enough experience to see to realize what you're seeing, right?
Yeah.
To actually see what those patterns could be telling you. And I think we don't often give people enough variety of experience to really see those contradicting things. And I think in pharma, for example, you tend to slot yourself into one specialty or one skill very quickly. So I'm in R&D, or I'm in supply chain, or I'm in commercial, or whatever it is. And you don't have the breadth of experience to actually know when you're running across a blockbuster idea, because you don't see how all those pieces fit. So I think there's this notion of lateral thinking. There's this creating space for it. There's making room for patterns to make themselves felt, all of which have a contribution to serendipity. There's one last thing too, which is it's the willingness to let the system have a little slack in it. I mean, among the things we know about creativity is it's often a product of a wandering mind. So your mind is not doing something. You're bored, you're looking at the ceiling, you're in the shower, you're on a train, And my colleague Bill Duggan has done a ton of work on that, which shows that, those are the moments when your sort of unconscious mind puts these patterns together and they get revealed to you. It's those aha moments, right? And so I think this whole kind of bundle of having some slack time, seeing the patterns, having exposure to what Richtel calls your spice rack of possible realities, and then it kind of clicks together when you see it.
No, it's fascinating, because I mean, people will use serendipity as a thing and really dig into it. You look at what happened with something like Viagra. It's a classic case of people saying, "Oh, this was serendipitous," but it isn't obvious that you would have looked from a failed cardiovascular study to a market that had never existed before. You looked at that market with traditional market research. There was no opportunity. So to see something and create it and then go with it, where most people said, "Oh, that study failed for safety signals." Right? So I always think that should be telling companies something about that kind of, some slack in the system that allows people to think laterally about, well, it might not have done this, but this could be appealing if we were to go look at it.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see anything in the kind of corporate culture that enables that slack? Is it, is it embrace of uncertainty? Is it, desperation? What is there a predictor of opportunity seeking?
Well, I think a couple of very specific techniques companies use is multiple sources of funding and approval. So if you go to, say, 3M, which is widely regarded as very innovative, if you've got a champion for an idea, there must be 100 places you could go to get funding and support. So there's grants that you can get. There's different kinds of fora you can get. You can join a community of practice. Now, not huge amounts of money, right? But enough money to tinker with your idea. And I think that's so. So principle number one is don't allow one person to dictate what ideas get greenlighted or not. Then have multiple places which have little pockets of resources you can appeal at. Another company that's very interesting in this regard is Amazon, which is very future forward on the topic of failure. And one of the things I admire that they do that a lot of other companies don't is they actually interrogate their failures. So they'll look and say, okay, so we had these hypotheses about this and that and this and that was going to happen. It didn't happen that way. But what have we learned? So as an example, they had a product back in the early days of digital streaming. It's called Amazon Unbox. And we didn't have high-speed broadband in everybody's home. And we didn't have devices that could display, high-quality movies. And we didn't even have a stock of high-quality digital movies, even if we had all the other stuff. So you're looking at a very disadvantageous point in the evolution of that category of offering. And so Unbox was supposed to be their sort of foray into digital film and streaming. And it was a disaster. And then they took a step back and they said, wait a minute, what didn't work, right? And what didn't work is the experience itself wasn't seamless. A lot of the ecosystem dimensions that they would have needed weren't there. And so they said, well, wait a minute, rather than selling Unbox as a service that people would pay for, why don't we change the purpose for Unbox and make it part of what subsequently became Amazon Prime Movies? So the goal now has shifted. So you're not making a service you're selling by yourself. You're making a service that's making your Prime offering ever more irresistible. And because you're not charging for it, and this is important, people aren't going to whine that the selection isn't that good. People aren't going to whine that, the download took a little while. You're getting it for free. What right of you to complain? And so you're turning something that was a real disadvantage into something that in the eyes of that target consumer was a real advantage. So to me, there's this willingness to be curious and question that's a big part of navigating through something that didn't work out.
And the asymmetry of learning, and seeing that as a learning process instead of a knowing process or a proving process is, because again, I've written a little bit about the pilot mindset that some companies run pilots, and and sometimes it's hard to tell if they're doing it in order for it to fail, and then say, "Oh, we tried it. Let's not do that again." Or if they're running it with a genuine goal of learning, right, which is that you get to the end of it and you'll know something that you couldn't possibly have known before you did the pilot. Do you see a difference in companies that fall into those two camps, or how would you describe a pilot mindset?
Well, I think the difference is running an experiment with a genuine experimental mindset versus running an experiment when you've already made up your mind about the answer and you're going to fight to the death to prove that you're right, right? And I mean, more wet breath is wasted in large organizations about being right than maybe any other topic I've ever witnessed. So, you'll get into a pricing conversation, let's say, and one person will say, I think it should be 52. And another person will say, no, it should be 78. And you're arguing and arguing, and you haven't got any data in the room, right? And so the logical thing to do is to run an experiment. And so we've got genuine uncertainty here. Here's 3 plausible hypotheses. Let's see which one seems to hold out, if any of them do. But set them up as experiments where you've got a hypothesis, you've got a predicted result, you've got a predicted outcome, and you've got an actual pattern you can test and interrogate. Even if companies are willing to go into experiments, a lot of times they design them so badly you really don't learn anything.
It's interesting, and I know you've been interested in asking you about your writing on assumptions, right? Because assumptions is one of those words that everyone thinks they understand, but actually people have very different understandings of what an assumption is. So some people have that mindset of, I've given you my assumption and it's right, and now I'm going to defend it, versus this is just an assumption. It has confidence intervals. It has, where it came from. It has a certain evidential quality, has a certain, role in decision quality. But some people, some organizations, they take those assumptions and they run with them, right? So the probability of success is 75% here. And you go, well, I don't mind the number, but I want to know what your range was. I want to know where it came from. And a company that is comfortable with that uncertainty is fine. I think a company that bakes those 75% in as the assumption, they start to struggle. So I'd be interested, could you elaborate a little bit on, your thoughts around assumptions in planning?
Oh, sure. Well, human beings are terrible at assumptions. They just are terrible. So one of my earliest encounters with this was the work of Russ Akoff at Wharton. And years ago, what he would do is he would go around companies making important strategic decisions. And all he did was he interviewed people at the point the decision was being made about why they were making the decision. And he wrote this down, and he called it his assumption checklist. And he'd go back regularly and ask the same people what they were thinking about that same decision. Now, that same decision, of course, is reseeding now in history, right? It's been a while since we had thought about that. And he discovered that after about 6 weeks, nobody in the place could remember half the assumptions that they had articulated to him at the time the decision was made. So the first problem with assumptions is a big chunk of them get forgotten. Now, the second problem is the ones that don't get forgotten get turned into facts in our mind. And we forget it was just our assumption, right? So if I take a recent pretty spectacular flameout, right, the Quibi video system, right, it's backed by Jeffrey Katzenberg and very, very Meg Whitman, really famous people, $2 billion of capital raised. I mean, on this idea that what millennials really want is high quality 10-minute movies. Well, forgive me for saying this, but I could have tested that assumption for you at spending a lot less than $2 billion, right? And what you could do is sure, to do a big Hollywood type movie, you'd have to have it very fun, but you could at least come up with, hey, if I had your favorite action figure in this thing, you could figure out how to cut out, say, 10-minute really complete stories from existing films. I mean, there's a ton of ways you could have gotten market feedback on that, and yet we don't do it. And I think it's just emblematic of how we mismanage assumptions.
Yeah, that's the thing, because I haven't put that together. And I know Michael Rea in the Innovators Hypothesis talks about is 5 by 5, things you can learn quickly and cheaply that will give you some clue but there is that decisive hesitation in it, which is, let's not take the decision today. Let's take a decision in a month's time or five weeks' time. Even that is a positive step, I think, in some of those decision processes, because I get to the case study you just gave. 5 weeks' time, you might be in a very different mindset with some of this stuff anyway, once you've at least investigated or explored some of the assumptions that you've made yourself.
Mhm. Yeah, the other set of assumptions I think are super challenging are assumptions that have to do with the user's actual experience,
Right.
because we're sort of smart about what we do as an organization. So at Columbia, we deliver courses. At a pharma company, we deliver a drug. Blah, 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 blah. But what we don't see is all the places where the experience collapses, not necessarily because of anything we did or didn't do, but perhaps because it's an ecosystem partner or something, right? So let me take an example of buying something on the internet. Depending on your sector, anywhere from 63% to over 80% of customers abandoned internet shopping carts without buying anything. I mean, think about that. More than half of all the customers who came to the site, looked at it, decided to buy, were willing to put their thing in the cart, and then they just opted out. Now, most of the time when that happens, the company that's making the offer, selling the product, selling the service, whatever it is, has absolutely no idea why. And yet some researchers went back and studied it, and it was a very predictable set of things, right? The provider wanted me to create an account, and I don't want any interest in that. I didn't like the sketchy way they were looking after my credit card. The delivery time was too short or too long. You were going to cost me what for delivery? And people don't see that. And so we make all these assumptions about how fantastic our product is, and we fail to complete the connection to the actual customer activity.
Hmm. No, it's interesting, and maybe a question that just sprung up in that is the almost a linear sequence of people that need to make those choices, right? So, I mean, traditional pharmaceutical development, you've got scientists, you've got clinical folks, you've got operational folks, you've got manufacturing. All the way down the line, you've got the commercial people that have to go and sell this stuff to people, actual customers. So I'd be interested in maybe the prioritization in that chain, knowing that the product that you're developing, really you're developing with a view to it selling at some point. But the user experience is typically thought about way too late to make a difference to the product development. Is that something that's general, or is that am I thinking about pharma as an outlier here?
Well, I think pharma is different than a lot of other sectors because in many cases you have no choice. If you need that therapy to live, then that's a pretty compelling argument as to why somebody should be buying it for you, right? So I think that is different. Most products don't have that life or death kind of quality to them. But there's a lot of pharma that isn't life or death either. There's a lot of pharma that's life cycle or lifestyle or just a better way. So I think that category of life changing drugs is one category, and then the rest is something else. But yeah, I would agree. There's a real tendency to leave the design of the customer experience till the very end of the process. And when I talk to people in pharma, so we have to prove that the technology works, and then we have to prove we can do it at scale, and then we have to prove we can get regulatory approval, and blah 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 blah. And then you get to the end of the chain, and it's a horrible experience, for people. So I'll give an example. There are all these drugs now that need to be infused, right? And it takes a long time, and you have to typically go to a specialist place to get this to happen. And I mean, they're miraculous drugs. Don't get me wrong; these are amazing therapies, but nobody's really thought through. So I've got to now make an appointment at the hospital. I've got to show up, at the right time. With some of the drugs, I have to have someone drive me. The timing is unpredictable, so I might have to get there and wait. And. I mean, if you were designing the consumer experience to be accessible, you would design it really differently.
Yeah, definitely. No, it remains this challenge on your approach, discovery-based planning. I'll be interested in you first of all explaining that, because we have an approach. We talk about this sort of plan to learn, right? At least make yourself believe in a pre-decision mindset. The decision hasn't been taken, the decision is going to be taken in the future. Will you collect different evidence? And if you think the decision already has been made, and of course everyone changes their mindset as soon as they think, well, we're working towards a future decision. So Annie Duke, the author of Thinking in Bed, she talks about playing poker the same way. The early rounds are you're not playing to win, you're playing to find out. So the idea that in pharma you're doing the same thing, which is managing the uncertainty towards a future decision. I thought was, rather parallel to where you were with this discovery-based planning. So could you elaborate a little bit on the kind of mindset there?
Yeah, so discovery driven planning, well, it emerged, as I've said, out of this study that I did of flops, like these huge corporate failures with companies that you would think would sort of know their business.
Mm.
And what we found when we looked at how these things were planned is things like Euro Disney or FedEx's Zapmail or, Google Radio or things like that. So these are smart companies, right? These are not idiotic companies that systematically go out and hire the stupidest people they can. I mean, that's not the problem here. But what we found was a common pattern: untested assumptions taken as facts, very few opportunities for low commitment testing, leaders kind of aligned with damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead, I've committed to this and we're not changing our minds, and no opportunity to break the process into pieces and stop and see what's happening. So, what discovery driven planning became was a response to that. So, we said, okay, first thing you want to do is define what success would look like. So, let's agree on where we're trying to go with this thing. And this is where you get the question of materiality for a big company. If I'm going to be a venture for a company the scale of, say, Novartis, I'm going to have to be a very high potential thing. I've got to affect a lot of people's lives. It's got to have a big impact. If I'm doing a little entrepreneurial thing, it doesn't need to be quite so large. So what does success look like? Then we back into, well, okay, so what's your business model? Right? What's your unit of business? What do you think you'll be selling? And roughly, what do you think you'll be charging for that? Now, if you can get some hypotheses about those three things, what you can do is create what we call a reverse or upside down income statement. And that basically says, let's say, just as you and me, if I wanted to make $100,000 of profit in a year and my gross margin was 20%, that means I have to earn $500,000 of revenue in that year, right? So you're starting with something you care about, in this case, profits, and backing into what would have to be true for those profits to be delivered. And then what you can do is just follow through with the document we call the deliverable specifications. So it's, okay, so if you need to sell $500,000 worth, how much per unit? Okay, so what are the costs going to be involved in doing that? So what you're doing is defining success, defining your competitive reality. So does this thing imply that you've got to sell 10 of them per day to every man, woman, and child on the planet? Because that's probably not very realistic. Or is it a realistic kind of thing? Then we document the actual operational activities that have to happen. So, do you need warehouse space? How many salespeople think you're going to need? What are you going to do in terms of manufacturing cost? And as you're doing that, right, by definition, you're going to be making assumptions. So, what we ask you to do is document them somehow so that you can capture what they were. And then the heart and soul of the process is really planning to what I call key checkpoints, where a checkpoint is a learning moment. So, it could be an experiment. It could be a set of customer interviews. It could be the creation of a prototype. It could be something that happens in the world that firms up something. So a law gets passed or a regulation is shifted or whatever. But the idea is you plan through each checkpoint, and that at each checkpoint you ask what we call the race questions. Should we redirect? Do we have new evidence that suggests we should do something different? Should we accelerate? Maybe we should, get on with it. Our competitors are catching up. Should we just continue? Or should we exit? And we ask the exit question at every checkpoint. And what that forces people to do is almost like in your premortem, it's like, well, hang on, given what we know, given what we've learned, given how different the assumptions are now than what we started with, maybe stopping is the most sensible thing we can do.
Interesting. No, it's, it's always amusing because when you say this stuff out loud, it seems so obvious, but you have so many processes baked into companies which are at odds with most of that thinking. But I'm aware time's getting away from us. I'm keen to get on to where you're going next, which is around strategic inflection points. So, because the new book's focused on that, could you tell us what they mean to you, strategic inflection points?
Yeah, so the term was invented by Andy Grove back in the 90s in a fantastic book called Only the Paranoid Survive. And he talked about them as something that really changes what's true about your business. So I define a strategic inflection point as a change in what's possible that has the potential to create a 10x shift, 10x faster, 10x cheaper, 10x more convenient. So at first I was looking at these things kind of going, well, so great. What do you do about that? If a meteorite comes and hits your business, how are you supposed to do anything about that? So the piece of the puzzle that made the book work for me was they feel when they happen as though they happened overnight. Like, how did this happen? It's just wow. At that moment of inflection, right? But if you go back in time and look, they've usually been brewing for years, sometimes decades before it actually shows up on your doorstep. And that to me is the strategic opportunity. If you can be watching them and tracking them all along, when that moment happens, you can be prepared.
Yeah. Yeah. So you've got to be in the water when the wave comes. Somebody said the budget time for swimming is really important. I need to ask you a couple of things which are more, I guess, personal. So around things, your reading list at the moment. Are there books that you'd absolutely recommend in this space, or are there books that you're reading at the moment that you'd recommend to folks?
Oh, absolutely. So on the whole innovation creativity thing, I adore Safi Bakal's Loonshots. It's just such.
I think he was the first guest on this podcast.
Oh, was he? Oh, there you go. Well, he's a good choice. Excellent taste. In the question of how you actually get the organization to respond, I do recommend Jeff Pfeffer's book on power. I mean, it's not directly related to innovation per se, but it is directly related to how you get stuff done and why things go wrong in companies that you need to learn. So it's called 7 Rules of Power. I think that's a huge, hugely impressive book. One of my colleagues, Eric Johnson, has written a book about making decisions. And so here's a little puzzle that he opens the book with. Why is being the default search engine on an iPhone worth Google paying Apple $20 billion a year? And if you think about it, this is something a user could default away from in, I think it's 6 clicks, right? So in less than a minute, I could give up on Google as the default engine. So there's no like entry barrier. There's no traditional strategic, thing that would cause you not to do that. But Eric's answer is it's all about the decision framing, the decision context. And that when we understand the decision context, we're able to shape how decisions flow. So I think that's a very interesting one. Another one is the Kahneman book on thinking fast and slow. I think that's very, very powerful. And then just for fun, Jennifer Aker and Naomi Bagdonis's Humor Seriously, I think is great for how you bring humor into tense situations and defuse them.
I would love to explore that with you a little bit more, because it's one of our cultural kind of values, that humor is actually how humans put ideas out there without needing to be wedded to them. Right? It's not just a disruptive South Park type stuff, but there's a lot more in the engagement where if you're smiling at someone, the idea gets taken a lot more gently than if it's than if you're in an adversarial situation. My producer always asked me to ask this question. So the segment's called This or That. So in a team environment, do you prefer disruption or innovation?
In a team environment?
Yeah.
Well, innovation, I would say, but disruption has come to mean so many things to so many people that it's hard to get your head around. Matt Richtel would tell you that when you talk about disruption, it actually causes people to feel very uneasy. That because by definition, if you're disrupting something, the old way isn't going to work anymore, and the new way hasn't yet been invented. And so I think it makes people feel uncomfortable when you talk about disruption.
Yeah, it's an interesting term, isn't it? It's become that everyone wants it, but no one really wants it to come from the bottom up. It's top-down disruption's okay. I could talk to you for another few hours, Rita, but I know that you've got other things to do. So, if people want to find you on the internet or elsewhere, what's the best way of doing that?
So my website is ritamcgrath.com. That's a good place to start. I publish articles every week under the title Thought Sparks, and so you can find them. I think I have an archive going back to 2005. So if you're interested in my thinking on things, you can search on there. It's searchable, it's clickable, you can find them, and that's totally free. You can also subscribe there if you want to get regular emails delivered to your inbox. So that's one place. And then I have a tools company called Belize, which is offering learning modules and some software and some advisory to kind of bridge that gap between, okay, now I get the idea. How do I make it work in my company? That's really what Belize is all about. And that's VALIZE.com.
Fantastic. I will certainly include all of that in the show notes. So I would encourage people to find you. I found your LinkedIn blog way too late, so apologies for that, but it's great reading, so thank you for putting it out there. This has been a huge pleasure. Thank you, Rita, for this.
Thank you very much for having me.
That's it for this week's episode of Idea Collider. To continue the conversation, visit our website at ideapharma.com. Follow us in your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. Don't forget to rate and review us on Apple Podcast. Until next time, I'm Mike Rea, wishing you great success.